Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're exploring a book called Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature.
Oh, yeah, this is by Janine Benyus,
Well,
right?
that's right. It's all about looking to nature for design solutions. Kind of like nature's the ultimate inventor, you know?
Right, like instead of reinventing the wheel, let's see what nature's already come up with.
Exactly. To kick things off, Benny's talks about this idea of biomimicry being both a race and a rescue. What'd you make of that?
Well, I think she's really highlighting how urgent this is. We're losing species and entire ecosystems so fast, and she's saying we need to learn from these natural systems before they're gone.
So the race is against time in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And the rescue part is about applying what we learn to create more sustainable solutions to our own problems.
So it's about learning from nature to save ourselves and the planet, basically.
That's a great way to put it.
All right, so let's dive into some specifics. Benny starts by looking at agriculture, which makes sense, right? I
Yeah.
mean, how we produce food has such a huge impact on the environment.
Absolutely. And our current system, well, it's not exactly sustainable, is it?
Definitely not. Benyus actually uses the word violent at one point, which is pretty strong language.
Yeah, she doesn't mince words. But her point is that we've kind of forced nature into this very unnatural system of monocultures and heavy pesticide use, and it's causing all sorts of problems.
Like soil erosion, water pollution, the loss of biodiversity.
Exactly. So Benius asks, what if we took a different approach? What if we modeled our agriculture after natural ecosystems that have thrived for millennia?
And that's where she introduces the work of Wes Jackson and the Land Institute, right?
Exactly. They're doing some fascinating work on what they call natural systems agriculture.
Which basically means mimicking how prairies work.
Right. Now, prairies are amazing. They're incredibly diverse, they're resilient, they require very little input from us once they're established.
And one of the key differences from our current agriculture is that they're dominated by perennial plants, right?
Yeah. Those are the plants that come back year after year. Unlike annual crops, which have to be replanted every season, perennials have these deep, interconnected root systems that help prevent soil erosion and improve water retention.
Plus, that diversity makes them much less susceptible to pests and diseases. It's like they have a built-in safety net.
Exactly. And Bennius highlights how this is a stark contrast to the way we farm now, with huge fields of single crops that are basically a feast for pests and diseases.
So it's about working with nature's strengths instead of trying to control it.
Exactly. And Bennius even shares this really cool example of what they're doing at the Land Institute. They have these experimental plots called shakedown plots.
Shakedown plots. That sounds kind of intense.
Well, it's actually a pretty clever idea. They basically plant all sorts of different perennial grain crops together in these plots and then let nature do its thing.
Like survival of the fittest.
Exactly. They're using natural selection to help them figure out which combinations of plants thrive best together, kind of like mimicking how prairies evolved in the first place.
So they're harnessing the power of evolution to create a more sustainable food system.
Exactly.
This is all super fascinating, but when I hear about these alternative approaches to agriculture, I always wonder, like, how realistic is this on a large scale?
Right. I think that's a question a lot of people have.
Like, can we really feed the world with prairies?
Well, Benyus acknowledges that, yeah, this is a long-term vision, but she argues that the environmental and social costs of our current system are just too high to ignore.
And she sees this shift towards natural systems agriculture as not just a necessity, but also as a chance to reconnect with nature in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, I thought that was a really powerful point. Like, it's not just about producing food more efficiently, it's about recognizing our place in the web of life.
Okay, so we've talked about mimicking prairies. What are some other natural systems that we can learn from when it comes to food production?
Well, Bennius also talks about permaculture, which has been around for a while but is gaining more traction these days.
I have to admit, permaculture always seemed a bit, I don't know, new agey to me.
I can see why you'd say that, but it's actually a very practical approach to designing self-sufficient systems that mimic the interconnectedness of nature.
Or like what kind of systems?
Well, she gives this really cool example of a greenhouse with a chicken coop built right in.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's like this perfect little ecosystem where the chickens provide warmth and fertilizer, and they also help control pests.
Exactly. It's brilliant. And it really illustrates how permaculture is all about maximizing those beneficial relationships between different species.
It's like instead of seeing ourselves as separate from nature,
Right.
we become part of the ecosystem.
Totally. And then there's another fascinating approach that Benyus highlights. It's based on the work of John J. Yule, who is studying how jungles regenerate.
So like how nature heals itself after a disturbance.
Exactly. And you will realize that this natural regeneration process could be harnessed to create incredibly fertile and productive agricultural systems. He called it creating a domestic jungle.
A domestic jungle? That sounds kind of wild.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. He basically proposed using a mix of perennial crops that mimic the structure and function of a jungle ecosystem.
So it's not just about planting trees, it's about recreating that entire web of life.
Exactly. And one of the key principles is nutrient cycling. You know, in a jungle, nothing goes to waste. All those fallen leaves and branches decompose and release nutrients back into the soil, creating this incredibly rich and fertile environment.
And that's something we've totally lost in our modern agriculture. We're constantly depleting the soil and then relying on chemical fertilizers to try and make up for it.
Right. And those fertilizers have all sorts of negative consequences, from polluting waterways to contributing to climate change.
So Yule is saying, let's learn from the jungle.
Exactly. And Benyus points out that there's a researcher named Robert Hart who actually laid out a plan for creating these domestic jungles using crops like cassava, banana, coconut, and timber species. It's all about mimicking the jungle structure and its incredible ability to recycle nutrients.
Okay, so we've got prairies, permaculture, domestic jungles. These are all incredibly inspiring ideas.
All right.
But I'm curious, like, how do we actually get from where we are now to a more nature-inspired agricultural system?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Benyus doesn't shy away from the challenges. She estimates that it could take like 25 to 50 years, or even longer, if we don't really ramp up the research efforts.
Wow, that's a pretty long timeline.
It is. But she also makes the point that economic pressures, like the rising cost of fossil fuels and fertilizers, might actually accelerate this transition.
So it might not be a choice so much as a necessity.
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility.
But the cool thing is that even though this transition might be driven by necessity, Benyus sees it as an opportunity. An opportunity to not just fix our broken food system, but also to reconnect with nature in a more profound way.
I love that. It's like we have a chance to heal ourselves and the planet at the same time.
All right. So we have explored how nature can inspire a more sustainable approach to agriculture. Let's shift gears now and talk about energy.
Great.
Because, let's be honest, our current energy system is also pretty unsustainable.
Oh yeah, big time. We're still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, which are polluting the planet and contributing to climate change.
It's crazy, right? Like, we're literally burning up the planet to power our lives. Benyus actually makes this really interesting comparison between purple bacteria and solar cells.
Oh yeah, that was a good one. She points out that these tiny bacteria are way more efficient at capturing sunlight than any solar panel we've ever created.
Which is kind of humbling, right?
Totally. It's like we're fumbling around with flashlights when nature has already invented the sun.
Exactly. And she even talks about how, back in 1912, a chemist named Giacomo Siemischen envisioned a world powered by forests of clean glass tubes that mimic photosynthesis.
That's amazing. He basically predicted the future of solar energy over a century ago.
I know, it's incredible. But even with all the advances in photovoltaics, Benyus points out that our solar panels still fall short in some key areas.
Like,
Well, for one, they're not as compact or as efficient as the systems found in plants. And they also require a lot of energy and resources to manufacture.
so we still have a lot to learn from nature.
A lot. And this is where things get really exciting for me. Benyus takes us inside some cutting-edge labs where scientists are working on something called artificial photosynthesis.
Oh yeah, that's the holy grail, isn't it? If we could crack the code of photosynthesis, it would be a game changer for our energy system.
Totally. And one of the labs she focuses on is at Arizona State University, where they're taking this really collaborative approach to basically build a synthetic system that mimics how plants capture and store energy from sunlight.
So they're trying to create a mini power plant based on a leaf.
Exactly. And one of the scientists leading this effort is Thomas Moore, who dives deep into the details of how photosynthesis actually works.
Okay, and this is where I might need you to slow down a little bit. My science is a little rusty.
No worries, I'm right there with you. Benyus does a great job of explaining it in a way that's understandable for us non-scientists. So basically, she starts by talking about chlorophyll.
Oh, right, the stuff that makes plants green.
Exactly. And chlorophyll is crucial for absorbing sunlight.
Right, and that's the first step in photosynthesis, right? Capturing that energy from the sun.
Exactly. And when chlorophyll absorbs light, It triggers this whole chain reaction where electrons get transferred from one molecule to another.
Electrons. Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. Can you remind me what exactly are electrons again?
Well, you can think of them as tiny packets of energy.
Okay, tiny packets of energy. Got it.
And when sunlight hits chlorophyll, it energizes those electrons, and then they get passed along this chain of molecules, kind of like a relay race.
Oh, I see. And what happens at the end of the relay race?
That's where things get really interesting. This transfer of electrons creates something called a membrane potential.
Membrane potential. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds a little intimidating.
I know, right? But it's actually not that complicated. Imagine a battery with its positive and negative terminals.
Gotcha.
Well, the membrane potential is kind of like that. The energized electrons create this separation of charge across a membrane. And that separation of charge is basically stored energy.
So it's like the plant is creating a battery using sunlight.
Exactly. And then the plant uses that stored energy to power all sorts of important processes, including the production of ATP.
ATP. Now, refresh my memory. What does ATP stand for again?
It stands for adenosine triphosphate.
Okay, adenosine triphosphate.
But you could just think of it as the energy currency of life. All living cells use it to fuel their activities.
So the plant is basically converting sunlight into ATP, which it can then use as its fuel. That's amazing. And how does it actually make that conversion?
Well, there's this special enzyme called coupling factor that plays a crucial role. It acts like a tiny turbine. As the energized electrons flow through it, they cause it to spin, and that spinning motion generates ATP.
It's like a tiny little engine powered by sunlight.
Exactly. And get this, the whole process of electron transfer happens incredibly fast. We're talking picoseconds.
Picoseconds. How small is a picosecond?
A trillionth of a second.
A trillionth of a second. Wow, that's mind-bogglingly fast.
I know, right? Scientists have to use these incredibly sophisticated lasers and other techniques to even study these reactions.
It's amazing that we can even measure something that happens so quickly.
It really is. And these insights are not just scientifically fascinating, they have the potential to totally revolutionize how we harness and use energy.
So it's not just about understanding nature, it's about using that understanding to create new technologies.
Exactly. And speaking of new technologies, Benyus introduces us to more researchers at ASU who are focused on building something called artificial antennas.
Artificial antennas, what are those?
Well, they're taking inspiration from the light harvesting structures in plants.
Yeah.
You know how plants can capture sunlight so efficiently?
Mhm.
Well, it's because they have these amazing antennas that are made up of molecules like chlorophyll and carotenoids. And these molecules are arranged in a specific way to maximize light absorption.
So they're like tiny little solar panel.
Exactly. And the ASU team is trying to replicate this design in their artificial antennas. One of their breakthroughs was creating a molecule called the triad.
A triad. Okay. What's so special about the triad?
Well, it's a simplified antenna that's designed to capture light and then separate charges.
Separate charges. Does that have something to do with that membrane potential we were talking about earlier?
It does. Remember how we talked about the battery analogy?
Yeah.
Well, the goal of an antenna, whether it's natural or artificial, is to use light energy to create that separation of charge, which can then be used to generate electricity or drive other processes.
So they're basically trying to create a tiny light-activated battery.
You got it. And Benyus talks about the painstaking work that went into building this triad molecule. She highlights the role of Anna Moore, a chemist who actually synthesized the molecule.
It sounds like she's a real pioneer in this field.
She is. And they actually achieved something called long-lived charge separation with this triad molecule.
Long-lived charge separation. Okay. What does that mean exactly?
It means they were able to hold those separated charges apart for a significant amount of time, and that stored energy can potentially be used to do useful work.
It's like they captured lightning in a bottle, but on a microscopic scale.
That's a great analogy. And then, get this, they went on to create an even more efficient molecule called the pentad, which had even longer-lived charge separation.
So they're not just copying nature, they're actually improving on it.
In a way, yes.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking those basic principles from nature and then pushing them even further.
That's pretty awesome. And what kind of applications do they see for these molecules?
Well, Benyus mentions some pretty mind-blowing possibilities like paint on solar harvesters.
Paint on solar harvesters? What does that even mean?
Imagine painting your house with a substance that could generate electricity from sunlight.
Wow, that would be amazing. We could turn our homes into power plants.
Exactly. But of course, one of the challenges with solar energy is storage, right? Like, what do we do when the sun isn't shining?
Right, we need a way to store that energy for later use.
And that's where the work of another researcher, James Goulet, comes in. He's also working on artificial antennas, but his focus is on using them to create a storable fuel.
Interesting. What kind of fuel?
He's looking at hydrogen as a possibility.
Hydrogen, that makes sense. It's a clean-burning fuel that can be stored and transported relatively easily.
Exactly. And Goulet has this really fascinating way of explaining how natural pigment antennas work. He uses the analogy of tuning forks.
Tuning forks. Okay, now I'm really curious. How do tuning forks relate to photosynthesis?
Well, imagine you strike a tuning fork. It vibrates at a specific frequency. If you have another tuning fork nearby that's tuned to the same frequency, it will also start to vibrate, even though you didn't directly hit it.
Right, because of resonance.
Exactly. And that's kind of similar to how natural pigment antennas work. They're made up of molecules that are tuned to absorb specific wavelengths of light. When those wavelengths hit the antenna, it creates a resonance, and the energy gets transferred from one molecule to another.
I see. So those molecules are kind of like tiny tuning forks, all vibrating in sync.
You got it.
Yeah.
And Gia wants to replicate this resonance effect in his artificial antennas. He's developed something called a photozyme.
Photozyme, okay. What is that?
It's basically a tiny microreactor that uses sunlight to drive chemical reactions.
It's like a little solar-powered factory.
And one of the reactions he's focusing on is splitting water molecules to produce hydrogen.
Wow. So he's literally using sunlight to create fuel.
He is.
Yeah.
And one of the cool things about these photozymes is that they operate at room temperature and in water, so they're much more environmentally friendly than traditional chemical processes.
That's incredible. So we could potentially create clean, renewable fuels using nothing but sunlight and water.
Exactly. And this is just one example of how biomimicry can help us transition to a more sustainable energy future.
It's amazing to think that the solutions to some of our biggest challenges might already exist in the natural world. We just need to open our eyes and pay attention.
I couldn't agree more. Nature is full of amazing designs and processes that we can learn from.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Benyus explores so many more applications of biomimicry in her book, from materials science to architecture to information processing.
Well, I'm excited to dive into those in our next deep dive, but for now, we'll have to leave it there.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation.
Thanks for joining me. Okay, so we've seen how nature can inspire us to rethink agriculture and our energy systems.
And produce food and capture energy in a more sustainable way.
Exactly. But what about the stuff we make? The materials we use to build our houses, our cars, our clothes.
Our gadgets and gizmos, all that good stuff.
All of it. I mean, think about the impact of our manufacturing processes on the planet. All the resources we extract, the waste we generate, the pollution.
It's a lot. Benyus actually has some pretty sobering statistics about that in her book.
Oh, yeah. What does she say?
Well, she points out that just 4 industries, paper, plastics, chemicals, and metals, account for a whopping 71% of all toxic releases from U.S. manufacturing.
71%. That's mind-boggling.
I know, right? It's a huge problem. And she argues that we need to rethink the way we design and manufacture things from the ground up.
So instead of just trying to reduce our impact, we need to fundamentally change the way we make things.
Exactly. And that's where biomimicry comes in again. Benyus believes that nature has already solved many of the material science challenges we're facing.
So it's back to the idea of nature as the ultimate inventor.
Exactly. Billions of years of evolution have resulted in some incredibly elegant and efficient designs.
So where do we start? How do we actually learn from nature when it comes to materials?
Well, Benyus introduces this really cool concept called ordered hierarchical structure.
Okay, ordered hierarchical structure.
Yep.
Got it.
And she uses all sorts of examples from nature to illustrate this concept, like tendons, abalone shells, even rat teeth.
Rat teeth, that's an interesting one.
Right? But her point is that nature often builds materials with complexity at different scales. So you've got these tiny building blocks that are organized into larger structures, and then those larger structures are organized into even larger structures, and so on.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls, but for materials.
Exactly. And this hierarchical structure gives these materials some pretty amazing properties. They can be incredibly strong and lightweight, flexible and tough, and they often have self-healing abilities.
It's like nature's version of nanotechnology.
Totally. And Benyus argues that we need to start thinking about materials in the same way, building them from the bottom up, using nature's blueprints as inspiration.
So not just copying what we see, but really understanding the underlying principles.
Exactly. And she takes us to a lab at the University of Washington where a scientist named Mehmet Sarakaya and his team are doing just that. They're trying to mimic the structure and properties of abalone shell.
Abalone shell. That's a beautiful material, but I never thought of it as being particularly strong.
Well, it turns out that abalone shell is incredibly tough, and it gets its strength from its hierarchical structure.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more.
So basically, abalone shell is made up of these layers of calcium carbonate crystals called nacre, which are held together by a protein matrix.
So it's like a natural composite material.
Exactly. Think of it like fiberglass or carbon fiber, but designed by nature.
That makes sense. But what's so special about this nacre stuff?
Well, the way those crystals are arranged and the way they're bonded together by those proteins creates this incredibly strong and resilient material.
And Sarakaya's team is trying to replicate this in the lab.
They are, and it's no easy task. They had to first figure out which proteins were responsible for the unique properties of nacre.
So it's like they had to crack the code of abalone shell.
Exactly. And they actually got help from a diverse scientist named Rich Humbert, who helped them collect and analyze abalone shells to find those key proteins.
A diverse scientist. That sounds like a pretty cool job.
It does. And once they identified those proteins, they used genetic engineering techniques to produce them in larger quantities using bacteria.
So they're harnessing the power of bacteria to make new materials.
Yep. It's a fascinating example of bio-inspired manufacturing.
And what kind of potential applications do they see for this abalone-inspired material?
Oh, the possibilities are endless. They talk about lighter and stronger cars, new types of medical implants, even more durable and sustainable building materials.
It sounds like we're on the verge of a materials science revolution, all thanks to a humble abalone shell.
I know, right? And abalone shell isn't the only natural material that's inspiring innovation. Benyus also dives into the fascinating world of spider silk.
Spider silk, yeah, that stuff is amazing. Stronger than steel, tougher than Kevlar, and is also super stretchy.
Right. It seems like it defies the laws of physics.
It really does. So what's the secret to spider silk's incredible properties?
Well, Benyus introduces us to Christopher Viney, a scientist who's spent years studying spider silk. He's fascinated by how spiders can transform a liquid protein solution into this incredibly strong and flexible fiber.
So, like, how do they actually spin silk?
Well, it turns out that spider silk is made up of these long chains of protein molecules that are arranged in a very specific way. And this arrangement gives spider silk its unique combination of strength, toughness, and elasticity.
So it's all about the molecular architecture.
Exactly. And Viney discovered that the key to this architecture lies in the amino acid sequence of those silk proteins. He found that they form these repeating patterns that create both crystalline regions, which provide strength, and amorphous regions, which provide flexibility.
So it's like a perfect blend of hard and soft materials, all woven together at a molecular level.
You got it. And this has inspired scientists to try and create artificial spider silk in the lab.
Oh, wow. Are they actually able to do that?
They are. Benyus highlights the work of David Kaplan, a researcher at the U.S. Army's Natick labs, who's using genetic engineering to produce artificial spider silk using bacteria and yeast.
So we could be wearing clothes made from artificial spider silk one day.
It's definitely a possibility, but the potential applications go way beyond clothing. Think about super strong and lightweight ropes, biodegradable sutures for surgery, even new types of building materials.
The possibilities are mind-boggling. It makes you realize just how much potential there is in the natural world.
I know. And speaking of potential, Benyus shares this really interesting story about rhino horn.
Rhino horn, what about it?
Well, as you know, rhinos are being poached for their horns, which are highly valued in some cultures for their supposed medicinal properties.
Yeah, it's a horrible situation. Those poor animals are being driven to extinction.
It is, and Benyus introduces us to these two scientists, Daniel and Anne Van Orden, who are trying to create a substitute for rhino horn using keratin.
Keratin, the stuff in our hair and nails.
The very same. It turns out that rhino horn is basically just a super compressed and structured form of keratin.
Huh, I never knew that.
Yeah, and the Van Ordens are trying to replicate that structure in the lab to create a convincing substitute for rhino horn.
Wow, so they're basically 3D printing a fake rhino horn.
Exactly. And if they can pull it off, it could have a huge impact on the illegal wildlife trade.
Yeah, if poachers can't tell the difference, maybe they'll stop killing rhinos for their horns.
That's the hope.
Fur.
And it's just another example of how biomimicry can be used not just to create new materials, but also to help protect the planet.
It's such a powerful reminder that our own survival is intimately connected to the health of the natural world.
And that by learning from nature, we can not only meet our own needs, but also protect the biodiversity of our planet.
It's a win-win for everyone. Okay, so we've seen how nature can inspire us to rethink the way we produce food, harness energy, and even create new materials. What's next on our biomimicry adventure?
Well, how about we explore how animals have mastered the art of smart eating?
Smart eating. Yeah, okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. So we've explored how nature can inspire us to rethink how we grow food, how we power our lives, and even how we design the materials we use every day. It's amazing to see how much nature has to teach us, right?
It really is. And Benyus goes beyond just presenting these fascinating examples. She provides a framework for how we can actually apply these principles to create a more sustainable future.
Okay, so how do we take all this inspiration from nature and turn it into action?
Well, one of the big takeaways for me is this shift in perspective that Benyus advocates for. It's about moving away from this human-centered worldview and embracing a more nature-inspired one, recognizing that we're not separate from nature, but a part of it.
It's about humility, right? Acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that nature might actually hold the keys to solving some of the biggest challenges we're facing.
Exactly. And throughout the book, she gives all these compelling examples of how nature has already solved these challenges. From energy efficiency to resilient materials to sustainable food systems, it's all there.
It's like nature is this vast library of solutions just waiting to be discovered.
Right. And another key point that Benyus emphasizes is the importance of collaboration. She talks about scientists, engineers, designers, architects, policymakers, all working together, drawing inspiration from nature to create innovative solutions.
So it's about breaking down those silos between different disciplines and realizing that we need to approach these challenges from multiple perspectives.
Totally. And Benyus even suggests bringing artists and poets into the mix, recognizing that their creativity and unique ways of seeing the world can offer valuable insights.
It makes sense. Nature isn't just a source of technical solutions, it's also a source of inspiration and wonder. And ultimately, I think that's what makes biomimicry so powerful, right? It's not just about mimicking. It's about connecting with nature on a deeper level.
I couldn't agree more. It's about understanding the elegance, the efficiency, the resilience of natural systems, and then applying those principles to our own designs and technologies. It's about learning to think like nature thinks.
I love that phrase, think like nature. It really captures the essence of biomimicry, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of biomimicry, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. What can you learn from nature today that might inspire a positive change in your own life or work? Maybe it's about observing how a spider builds its web, or how a bird soars through the air, or how a forest regenerates after a fire.
Or maybe it's about noticing the incredible diversity of life in your own backyard, or the intricate patterns on a leaf, or the way a tree adapts to its surroundings.
Keep your eyes open, be curious, and don't be afraid to ask, what can I learn from this?
Because nature is full of amazing solutions just waiting to be discovered. And by embracing the principles of biomimicry, we can create a more sustainable and harmonious future for ourselves and for the planet.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating exploration, and I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to look to nature for solutions to the challenges we face. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep innovating.